bring in Michael Graham and Molly Hooper. Michael is a CBSN political contributor and columnist for the Boston Herald. He is in Boston. Molly is in Washington. She's a congressional reporter for The Hill. All right, I want to begin with Puerto Rico. After being criticized, Molly, for the federal response and lashing out at San Juan's mayor last weekend, what do you think President Trump accomplished on this visit Tuesday?
Well, given what's happened over the weekend with this gun massacre in Las Vegas, it was interesting to see and talk to members of Congress today, and there was much more subdued tone. Not that the Puerto Rico situation was in any way, you could even compare the two, really. It's just that we weren't seeing as much, as many volatile tweets coming from the president. And that's really what sparked this debate over Puerto Rico last week, when he criticized the mayor of San Juan for not being, quote, prepared enough. But you know what? When it comes down to it, really what San Juan, what Puerto Rico, what they need is they need the resources in order to get, disaster aid out to the folks who are victims of this hurricane. And that is one thing that Congress is going to act on, according to the people I talked to on the Appropriations Committee, as soon as the end of the week. I heard different things up on Capitol Hill about President Trump's reaction and the way he was received today. But again, a lot of people were thinking about what was going on in Vegas.
Yeah. Michael, what did you think about President Trump's trip to Puerto Rico?
Well, I think the president has a story to tell. I thought it was interesting, some of the reporting at the end of the week from media outlets that aren't friendly to Trump, who acknowledged Puerto Rico is a unique case. They quoted a naval official who'd been a part of a lot of hurricane and cleanup operations, who gave the Trump administration credit for forwardly deploying naval vessels so they would be there as soon as Maria passed, able to help shuttle materials. The stories of the cargo crates sitting at ports, but no drivers to take them. I think there's a story to be told there that shows that this is a terrible mess and the federal government did okay. But when President Trump talks about the real crisis, they had a real crisis in Katrina.
Right, that comparison, Michael. I mean, we played a clip of the president comparing, Puerto Rico to Katrina. I mean, what did you think of that?
I thought that was ridiculous. I thought that, look, when people are hurting, when 5% of the population has electricity, the last number I saw, when people are having to drink water out of streams, that is not the time. All you need to be saying, how can this get better now? And I would love for Trump to see that part of his role as president is to be an advocate for people who need an advocate. A lot of times you see him playing that role with his base, with those kind of blue-collar, Rust Belt voters. You can see he kind of tries to step in on their behalf. Well, Mr. President, there's 320 million Americans. They're the people of Puerto Rico who are Americans. They need you to step up, not say, this is nothing. They had a real crisis the other day. We did great.
Yeah, I mean, Molly, have you heard any reaction from folks that you've spoken with about that particular part of the president's visit and making that kind of comparison when, as Michael points out, and as we've heard from our David Begnaud, there are people who do not have the basic life support things that one needs: water, food, medicine at this time?
Well, that's true. And, and actually I have heard some folks say, even when the president's talking about Puerto Rico, he still kind of says, and, back in America, so, sort of with the implication that Puerto Ricans are not Americans, when in fact Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Right. So there is that. But the fact that, what Michael brought up earlier, that the administration, there were resources headed towards Puerto Rico. It's just that the infrastructure, and this is what I have heard, wasn't in place. Like the ports were wiped out, so you couldn't unload a lot of the products and get them out to the people. Situations like that, I have heard people who are heavily interested in Puerto Rican issues, especially Luis Gutierrez, who was really attacking the president last week. He wasn't as in attack mode today after visiting the island. So I think that they have seen what the president did, but making those comparisons again, yes, it's not how many died, it's just that somebody did. Anyway.
Yeah, we'll continue to watch that. Let's turn to the gun debate. Michael, you have a new op-ed on CBSNews.com where you write, in part, quote, Why is it that the conversation about guns inevitably ends in a cul-de-sac? There are three reasons for this: the left's lack of information, the right's distrust of reform, and the passionate minority problem. Briefly explain those three reasons for us, Michael.
Well, part of the problem when you try to talk about guns with people like Senator Murphy, who was saying they need to get off their bottoms and act, is that when they talk, they don't make a connection between the actions they want and the problem they want to solve. For example, talking about universal background checks means nothing in the case of Las Vegas. This guy was the perfect background check guy. He was an accountant, had money, no criminal record. The same with the shooters in Sandy Hook. It wouldn't have prevented Sandy Hook, wouldn't have prevented Virginia Tech, wouldn't have prevented the Pulse nightclub. And when gun control advocates make claims that gun advocates understand they don't really know what they're talking about, it raises suspicion. Hillary Clinton's tweet today or yesterday about suppressors, silencers, that just makes gun owners roll their eyes and say, I can't take your ideas seriously. You haven't taken the time to find out what the law really is and what's going on. At the same time, I interviewed Senator Mike Lee of Utah today for my podcast, and he was adamant that there's no reason for gun rights advocates to come up with legislation themselves in this moment of crisis. He was adamant that there's nothing else that needs to happen, that if it's up to the other side to come and craft, plans. And I think part of that comes from a distrust of the motives of the gun control community. There's a real fear among gun owners that the long game here is gun confiscation, something like Great Britain or Australia. And I'll tell you, it didn't help that President Obama, after a couple of shootings, specifically mentioned Australia as a model. So there's that distrust in the gun rights community. And finally, people point at the polls. They say, look at this, 55% of Americans want more gun control, 80% of Americans want background checks, etc. But for most Americans, guns are an issue among many. For that 30% or so of gun rights activists, this is the issue. And a highly motivated minority that votes on one issue will have more electoral impact than voters who say, oh, yeah, I care about gun control, but I care about taxes and life and whatever else. And so Democrats in swing districts don't want to go back home and face that energized group of voters, even if they're a minority, because they will absolutely show up on Election Day.
Yeah, Molly, what are you hearing from Democrats specifically? Because here's what Michael writes in this op-ed piece. In Congress, Democrats didn't act when they had a 60-vote majority and President Obama in the White House. That's because enough purple state Democrats feared facing the pro-2A Second Amendment folks back home to keep legislation from moving. So what is it that you're hearing now?
Interestingly enough, I spoke with Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Texas, a self-proclaimed Second Amendment guy himself, and he said, I am I'm quoting the congressman, of course. I'm a Second Amendment guy. I believe we should be able to have the right to have firearms. It's in the Constitution. However, as Michael was saying, and Cuellar made this point as well, when it comes down to these issues, you have the extremes. You have the extreme right, you have the extreme left. And really, where are the people in the middle? There's common sense ideas out there that need to be hashed out among the people who are in the center and have a more practical, pragmatic view of the issue, because when you get the extremes involved, you're not going to have a solution to move towards. And really, this involves, this is a conversation that needs to be had about gun safety, and gun safety is the new term right now that Democrats are using. Instead of gun control, it's gun safety. That will be what we will be hearing going forward. But, we really have to he said we really have to talk to the people who are more moderate on the issue. And what's interesting also up on Capitol Hill is there are two victims of gun violence. You have Gabby Giffords, who is a former member of Congress, who is from Arizona, who was shot in an event 6 years ago almost, and Steve Scalise, who just returned to Capitol Hill last week after getting shot in the hip in June by that on the baseball practice field in Alexandria with fellow congressional Republicans who are out at a baseball practice. And Gabby Giffords and Steve Scalise have very different opinions on what needs to happen moving forward. Scalise saying it fortifies that experience, fortifies his position, as a strong Second Amendment rights kind of guy, that you should be able to have a gun to defend yourself. whereas Gabby Giffords is calling for gun control. And so, you know, two individuals who were both shot by guns and, you know, impacted very different opinions on what to do about it.
Yeah. So, Michael, President Trump has suggested that there could be a discussion on gun policy at some point soon. And here's what Steve Bannon reportedly told Axios. It would be the, quote, end of everything for Mr. Trump if, in fact, there was some movement from the president towards that issue of supporting stricter gun control. First of all, do you see that as the case, that it would be, quote, the end of everything, as Steve Bannon has said?
Well, remember, Steve Bannon has also said that about other issues that he cares about, too, like the DACA, the Deferred Action on Children, you know, Childhood Aliens, and other things. So, you know, I mean, Bannon's playing his card. The Second Amendment people have been very strong for President Trump, very strong. You know, Trump was pretty much a New York kind of squish, as we say, on this before he was running for president. He was like, they ought to do something about them guns, you know. But he knows that this is a key part of his coalition. And the number of people I've spoken to who said, there's a lot about Trump I don't like. I don't think he's a real conservative. You know, his personal life bothers me because I'm a churchgoer. But I voted for him because I knew Hillary Clinton was going to help the people who want to take my guns. That was a key part of the Trump coalition in 2016.
Meantime, so Molly, are there any possibilities that Democrats are seeing here, maybe perhaps an opening to try and sit down and work some deal out on gun control policy with the president? Well,
they're kind of hoping he's going to go back to those squishy days when he did have problems with guns. I mean, because keep in mind, again, I feel like I'm sort of, you know, it's deja vu all over again. President Trump was a Democrat, and when, you know, gun violence would occur in the past, he was not afraid to say that guns are kind of problematic, and yet he still was endorsed by the NRA. You know, but to Michael's point, people don't want their guns taken away from them. And in terms of Democrats having a conversation with the president about it, perhaps there could be a conversation. I mean, he's conversing with on DACA. He's conversing on the debt ceiling. He's been conversing a lot. It's a matter of what's going to happen moving forward and how concerned members are. But to Michael's point again, keep in mind when Democrats were in control, they had 60 votes. Weren't able to move gun control.
Right.
So, you know, even if the president does have this conversation, it seems very unlikely that something's going to happen. Now, keep in mind, the House was supposed to vote on a measure this week that would have made it easier for gun owners to acquire silencers. This has the Hearing Protection Act, and actually Speaker Ryan pulled that bill from the floor and from floor consideration. So maybe the lack of action on a measure that would have made it easier to you know, silence your gun is seen as perhaps you know, a positive for folks who are in favor of gun control. However, I don't know if it goes much further than that.
All right, we'll continue to watch it all. Michael Graham and Molly Hooper, thanks to you both.
Of course.
Happy to be here.